I'm going to ask everyone to accept. I'm going to be recording. She is the producer and host of the Sounding Jewish podcast and the co-executive director of the Jewish Music Forum, a project of the American Society for Jewish Music. I was fortunate because we were in the same YIVO Yiddish summer intensive program a few years ago, I think right before the pandemic. And I knew how much Dr. Cooper at the time, Sheva, right, the Yiddish name, her Yiddish name, was learning a Yiddish as part of her career. And I was, as you know, taking some sabbatical time and learning Yiddish. And as I followed her career and started listening to what she was doing, I got excited when I found out she was going to be local and asked her if she would come to our congregation. So I'm delighted that you're here and really much looking forward to your presentation today.
Thanks so much for having me. Can everyone see the PowerPoint all right? Yeah, okay, great. Should we get started? Yeah, okay, great, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, both in person and online. This is very exciting for me. I haven't given a talk, a hybrid talk quite like this before, so I will do my best to speak to both audiences. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to. I just I wanted to just make sure that if I screen share, they wouldn't lose the view. I'm going to play it from start and see. Okay. Just if for some reason they can't see, let me know because I won't be able to see them once I screen share. Okay. Oh, and now of course I can't see anything. Yeah, I just okay. Yeah, I did screen share and then it made everything tiny and now I can't see anything. Okay, there we go. Now it seems to be in presenter view, but I don't know if that is working for them, if they can see the whole screen in presenter view or what are you seeing right now? Okay, yeah, I just don't know what that even is. Okay, I don't know what that drop down is though, because I don't, okay, good. Great. Okay, so let's give this a shot and we'll see what happens. Are you seeing just the PowerPoint?
I'm seeing one thing.
Oh, you're seeing presenter view. See, that's not what it should be doing. I think leaving it alone might be our best bet, honestly.
Okay, this is what we're doing at the moment. If we can figure out anything else, that's great, but we need to make sure the speaker can see what she's doing.
Okay. We'll just end the show right now. Because I think our options are just me expanding the screen or we us ending up with two screens. So I just needed to get it back and then we'll get started. I tried that slide. Well, let's see, slide to the clear from start. We'll see if that's any better. Okay. Takes a minute to get back to the full screen. It lets me do this. So
if you put it just on slideshow, it might fill the screen. Okay.
The only thing it seems to be giving me the option to do is if I try to play it is to play from start is presenter view, which means you're all going to get presenter view. So I'm just going to leave it alone and not make it full screen on my end and just expand it as much as I can for you. Okay. All right. So let's just give this a shot. I think this might be our best bet. I apologize. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a story today, and it's probably not the story that you're expecting. So bear with me, because there are some opera singers in here, but the story I'm going to share is not all about opera singers. Okay. So on March 15th, 1933, soprano Quina Murillo made an unusual request of the delegates of 200 constituent branches of the Federation of Jewish Women's Organizations at their monthly meeting at Temple Emmanuel. There, Murillo issued a plea for the support of the Metropolitan Opera Company, which faced an unprecedented $115,000 deficit as a result of the ongoing Great Depression. The Met required at least $300,000 of immediate support to ensure that there would be a future opera season. As the New York Times reported the following day, the Jewish woman delegates were very receptive to Murillo's plea, and they unanimously promised Mrs. David E. Goldfarb, president of their federation, to refer Ms. Murillo's plea to their respective groups, which had a membership of more than 100,000 women in the metropolitan area. But why did the esteemed Metropolitan Opera House decide to ask the Federation of Jewish Women's Organizations for its financial support? After all, doesn't requesting a donation necessitate at least a familiarity, if not an ongoing relationship between the beneficiary and the donor? To me, this anecdote bespeaks a much more enduring relationship between American Jewish women and the New York opera industry than has ever before been recognized by opera studies scholars or by American Jewish historians. The Met's financial request of the Federation only makes sense if we can account for the robust local Jewish women's engagement with opera that preceded it. In today's presentation, I will use assorted archival, oral history, and press findings to trace a lengthy relationship between Jewish women and the New York opera scene, which together heralded the Met's plea for aid. I find that Jewish women's participation in New York opera culture was enormously diverse. They could regularly be found attending operas and purchasing opera-related goods advertised to them in the Jewish press. Many also recognized opera as a powerful mode for social and racial uplift. Opera regularly featured in the social services and educational entertainment organized for incoming immigrants by established Jewish women. And of course, Jewish women worked for the opera industry in various capacities. Though their contributions as opera singers are well known, their work as ballet dancers, artist managers, vocal coaches, concert organizers, costume designers, and conductors has received a lot less attention. The Jewish women invested in opera were not only confined to the elite class. Rather, those from diverse backgrounds, nationalities, political orientations, and religious affiliations all found in opera a shared tool for acculturation, or what musicologist David Conway has termed social entryism. Today's presentation attends not only to the reform wealthy debutantes of German-speaking lands who subscribed to season tickets, but also to the immigrant working class women from throughout Eastern Europe who stood for hours in the family circle to hear their favorite arias. After briefly situating Jewish women within the larger framework of gendered, musical, and American Jewish immigrant history, I'm going to make a case for why they chose opera of all genres to serve their many personal and communal goals. Next, I'm going to look at Jewish women's opera going, their consumption of material opera goods, their philanthropic and educational uses of opera for their communities, and of course, their professional roles in the industry. Tracing Jewish women's lengthy relationship with opera culture reveals how the balance of power so drastically shifted from Jewish women relying on opera to the local opera industry relying on them. A discussion of Jewish women's roles in any industry necessitates beginning with recognizing the challenges of studying women at all. Practically speaking, women can be difficult to trace throughout the historical record. With changes in marital status often came changes in name. And so one of the subjects I'll be speaking about later today, opera coach Jessie Berndt, changed her name 4 times following consecutive marriages, which makes her very hard to track down. Additionally, changing social perceptions of women working in the public sphere, not to mention ever-present misogyny, have ensured that record-keeping of women's achievements remains much sparser than those of men's. In response, scholars such as musicologist Kimberly Francis have suggested that we need to create room to celebrate the work of powerful historical women. And sometimes we have to be really creative in how we go about trying to find them in the historical record. In many ways, Jewish women's participation in American musical life mirrored patterns established by their non-Jewish counterparts. Most American women's musical activities evolved from domestic amateur music making and teaching to performance and attendance to patronage and organization of public events. Like their non-Jewish contemporaries, Jewish women observed a religious tradition. They had to behave in ways deemed respectable by dominating male culture makers, and they served as keepers of culture in religious and secular spaces. However, their experiences in opera were also continuously shaped by their Jewish backgrounds. The specter of tznius prohibitions like Kol Isha and Shomer Negia overlaid Jewish women's possibilities for advancement in music, and especially in vocal performance, even if the majority who were pursuing this line of work were not religiously observant. And on screen, we have this quote where the Hebrew Standard notes that the reason why there seemed to be very few Jewish female opera singers or concert singers in public performance in 1914 was because Jewish girls of the more refined classes from which the modern artist is drawn are very reticent, reserved, and brought up in a very strict manner. And this article in particular gave the example of contralto Ottilie Metzger-Latterman, who apparently underwent a great struggle with her family to pursue a vocal career. And additionally, like other racialized women of the era, especially those from African American and Italian American communities, Jewish women's racial in-betweenness impacted not only how they perceived opera, but how the industry then treated them. But first, we need to address, if not the central question: why opera? Well, opera appealed to Jewish women for several reasons. It was a genre of music familiar to multiple generations of Jews from across Europe. In urban centers like Vienna, London, Berlin, and Odessa, Jews frequently came into contact with the opera. During an oral history interview, violin teacher Edith Eisler recalls how during her adolescence in Vienna, her folks loved to go to the opera, and they began taking her when she was 6 or 7. At the same time, opera in the United States underwent an important shift in the late 19th century that helps to explain its enduring appeal to Jewish women. As cultural historian Lawrence Levine explains, opera became increasingly sacralized in the American entertainment industry and associated with the upper class as it moved into new venues called opera houses, which were intentionally designed to segregate opera for more popular vaudevillian fare. As opera took on these associations with the upper class and with American clout, it gained this ability to uplift and empower disenfranchised populations. And in turn, Jewish women perceived that they and their charges could also be part of this parallel cultural ascendance by way of the genre. Coverage in newspapers and memoirs substantiates that Jewish women from across different backgrounds and classes attended the opera. While articles in the American Hebrew and Jewish Messenger and the New York Times recognized philanthropists like Mrs. Albert Guggenheim and Mrs. Ernest Ehrman as annual travelers to the Met, the Hebrew Standard similarly documented second-generation American writer and speaker Mrs. Esther Ruske's status as a habitué of the opera. For Adelaide Wolfe Kahn, the wife of philanthropist Otto Kahn, participating in the Met's governance and philanthropy was an extension of her responsibilities at home. Wolfe would attend with her husband, make donations, host guests from the Met, and even serve on the various boards of the association and guild. From the other end of the spectrum, we have Lithuanian anarchist Emma Goldman, who recounted attending a performance of Carmen at the Met in her memoir, Living My Life. And as part of that little narrative, she details how uncomfortable she was in her brand new shoes in the standing room because, she too wanted to look good at the opera. And if you have any interest in learning more about Goldman's story, I've actually written an article about it called Emma Goldman, an Anarchist at the Opera, which is available with the Journal of American Jewish History. But in spite of all of these women's different backgrounds, they in turn shared this belief that attending the opera could be a transformative experience. And of course, they realized that you had to look like you belonged among your peers in high society to go to the opera. Sitting in an opera box, of course, suggested that a person had obtained the most wealth and the most social elevation possible. And even though Jews could not own their own opera boxes at the Met before Otto Kahn became the first exception in 1917, affluent Jewish women and their husbands frequently rented or subscribed to opera boxes in early years, either for the regularly scheduled opera season or for private, sometimes even Jewish events, which we can talk about more in the Q&A if you'd like to. This is a typical example of a listing in the society pages, giving all of the names of the various people who are going to be seat holders at the upcoming opera season. Similarly, discussing opera emerged as a really important cultural activity for Jewish women in New York, especially in the middle and upper classes. The Jewish press would reinforce perspectives about opera by circulating news of upcoming performances and opera seasons, and by publishing celebratory lists of Jewish singers, opinion editorials, and stories about the opera. In response to an 1882 Jewish woman's request for assistance, which she wrote to the paper, titled, "What is to be done? The men won't call," writer Leah Cohen Harvey asserted in the Jewish Messenger that young Jewish women needed to be able to socialize with young men about opera in order to secure a husband. Similarly, in editor Minnie G. Lewis's 1892 article for the American Hebrew, she suggested that primary schools should offer a course in proper everyday behaviors to teach children the table dicta of polite society and knowledge of the correct way to comport oneself on all occasions, including in the theater or the opera. So this is primary school children that Jewish women are believing need to have opera education. Imaginings of Jewish women's racial uplift also graced the pages of the Jewish press. When in 1920, the American Hebrew and Jewish Messenger published non-Jewish writer Yetta K. Stoddard's Yellow Elbows, the story of a Jewish girl's faith in her abilities as a singer and the happy consequences of that faith, the paper and author framed knowledge of opera as possessing the inherent potential to contribute to Jewish women's racial uplift. In this work of fiction, a Russian Jewish immigrant girl successfully uplifts herself from the class of yellow elbows to polished ivory flesh tints through operatic education and performance. Many Jewish women's earliest associations with opera, I think predictably, derived from being the targets of men's marketing campaigns in the Jewish press, and as, of course, as consumers of opera-related clothing, accessories, beauty products, instruments, and music technologies. Since several Jewish studies scholars have observed that material acquisition and consumption became a sacred mode of socialization for Jewish immigrants in America. And so it really isn't all that surprising that Jewish women were wielding this new purchasing power as an avenue of opera engagement. And at the same time, opera was already a very materialistic enterprise, because one of the chief strategies to elevate opera from a more popular fare was setting a code of behavior, including a dress code deemed appropriate when attending the opera. And accordingly, several advertisements in the Jewish press, again, likely placed there by Jewish men who were serving as editors, would emphasize this drive towards uplifting and even whitening Jewish women consumers. The Jewish Messenger's fashion notes column of the 1880s gave Jewish women advice on what they should wear for evening and opera occasions. A series of 1890 ads for optician William Dengler's opera glasses in the Jewish Messenger were always complete with a sketch of a refined-looking woman using his products, and they assured readers that his opera glasses would add grace, give dignity, and lend comfort to every lady who acquired them. By 1922, Lord and Taylor's First Night's advertisement, which was published in the American Hebrew, esteemed the donning of fashionable gowns, wraps, and furs for an opera or play as an illustration of a woman's joint taste and refinement and her leadership abilities, immediately after women had won the right to vote. So you see there's this very clear play between politics and opera going, and all of this in the press aimed at Jewish women. And in the most literal sense, opera attendance began to garner an association with racial uplift among Jewish women, as advertisements for cosmetic products marketed to Jewish women would capitalize on connections between the allure of opera going and racialized notions of white femininity. In the American Hebrew's 1887 ad for Dr. James P. Campbell's arsenic complexion waters, the doctor promised a transparent complexion and finely textured skin, guaranteed to prompt copious invitations to the opera. The Hebrew Standard's 1911 ad for Plexo Evening White makeup, meanwhile, claimed to be indispensable to the woman preparing for dinner, opera, or ball. And of course, acquiring opera goods came to symbolize Jewish women's respectability. Opera glasses were one of the many beautiful things for sale at Jewish events, or they were gifted as a token of gratitude by men to their wives and mothers for their service efforts to Jewish organizations. And actually, you'll see they list as one of the subscription prizes for 1897, the gift of a fine opera glass, if you look really closely to the circled piece on the slide. The American Jewess as well, which was the first English language newspaper written by and for American Jewish women in the 1890s, would give readers who acquired at least 10 new paid-up subscribers the gift of a fine opera glass too. And though it might seem contradictory today, Jewish women did not understand their participation in the religious dimensions of Jewish life and their consumption of opera goods as mutually exclusive endeavors. Rather, Jewish historian Barbara Gershon-Blatt-Gimlet observes that much as a result of the movement of the Jewish holiday celebrations out of the home and into the public sphere, into places like opera houses, the Jewish holiday calendar then fortuitously converged with the social season and shopping cycles. And her observations also align with those of a writer for the Hebrew Standard in 1908, who reflected that although Jewish women in New York still dressed in white for the days of awe, they now wore opera cloaks and satin slippers, and they come to show themselves, such that even the synagogues and temples are so many exhibitions in millinery and dressmaking. And we have this clear substantiation of this story, because we know that Jewish women actually did own many of these various items, in addition to being sold them in the Jewish press. So philanthropist Mrs. Florence Schloss Guggenheim has her bejeweled opera glasses preserved today by the Museum of the City of New York. And the rose-colored silk Delphos dress and belt, bought by 25-year-old Mrs. Bertrand W. Kahn in Paris to wear to the Met in 1936, is held by the National Museum of American History. Okay. And of course, owing to opera houses' inherent grandeur, their physical size, and their incredible acoustics, Jewish women believed that hosting their communal events in opera houses, more than any other venue, could signify their collective ascendance into privilege in American society. Beginning in the 1880s, Jewish women regularly utilized New York opera houses to host fundraisers, Jewish holiday celebrations, and political rallies. And there were just an incredible number of organizations that would be part of these, like the National Council of Jewish Women, the Young Women's Hebrew Association, and Hadassah, the World Zionist Organization. And they would do complete operas, operettas, musical reviews, excerpts, you name it, they would do it. And we have the names of famous participants and box holders featuring in publicity material with much of this. A great example is when the Beth El Sisterhood organized a performance of Lucia di Lammermoor at the Met on March 6, 1900. And they actually went to Maurice Grau, who was a Jewish manager for the Metropolitan, who then took their request to the board of directors, and he got them permission to resell the stockholders' opera boxes as part of their fundraiser. And the Jewish papers celebrated this whole incident as them succeeding at swelling the coffers of the treasury in 1900. But of course, we can't just think about the wealthy social classes doing this kind of fundraising. We also have to think about the political dimensions of this story. And as we see, another vital example from the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum was the political rally that was held at the Met following the deaths of 146 mostly Jewish, poor, immigrant female workers in the Jewish-owned Triangle Factory fire on March 25th, 1911. And this rally, which was held on April 2nd, 1911, included a particularly memorable moment when Polish-born Jewish factory worker Rose Schneiderman got up and she offered this really moving speech from the front of the stage. And she berated the civic leadership for their neglect and encouraged all working people to organize and take action to prevent such a tragedy from ever recurring again. And of course, connecting the opera with moral uplift, Jewish-run women's organizations and individuals would arrange opportunities for teenagers, children, and immigrants to engage with opera. In 1885, the Ladies' Deborah Nursery hosted a benefit entertainment by the Thalia Opera Company for a group of, as they said, young ones who would otherwise be strangers to the most ordinary comforts of life. So opera has suddenly become an ordinary comfort of life. And similarly, there was a performance by the Ladies' Sewing Society of the Hebrew Orphan Asylum for orphans in 1892, which had the quartet from Rigoletto and a duet from La Traviata featured. And there's also this really fascinating group, actually for teenage women, called the George Eliot Literary Circle, which met in 1895, and they would meet at the Educational Alliance in New York. And the goal was to introduce working class Jewish Russians and American-born girls between the ages of 14 and 17 to the grand life of humanity by teaching participants about Wagner's Ring Cycle and taking them to the Met to see 2 operas. And the Jewish press looked at this circle and they celebrated it for its transformative impact on its participants and said how, quote, most of the members are now fully fledged young ladies who continue their education at college. So we have this direct connection again between Jewish women learning about opera and ascending into the higher planes, the higher spheres of society. And what's really neat is in the educational minutes for the National Council of Jewish Women in 1925-26, they actually hosted children's opera group in really small type as one of the responsibilities of their Committee on Immigrant Education. And then as late as 1940, we have the Yiddish Forward reporting that 14 East Side boys and girls who had won a music or essay contest then received tickets to a performance of Lakme at the Met. So opera is also this kind of gift that can be bestowed onto successful children. But again, we also have these much larger efforts that Jewish women are participating in to bring opera to the masses. And this example features Miss Minnie Guggenheimer, who made basically she set up this concert series, an outdoor summer concert series at Lewiston Stadium on the City College of New York campus beginning in 1918. And it actually became the longest running educational opera initiative ever organized by a Jewish woman. And it had excerpts, it had full-length operas, it had symphonies, but it lasted over 40 years and it entertained thousands of immigrants in New York at nominal prices. And when she was asked in 1924 why she'd started the summer concert series and undertaken what her daughter would call a full-time unsalaried job as impresaria of the world's largest scale musical project, Guggenheimer replied, quote, "Because I realized that New York starved for good music during the summer. A group of us came together and began working for a solution of the problem of how to extend education to others who might in this way acquire a taste for the best art without knowing they were skirting culture. Eventually, we hit upon the stadium idea. Here was the admirable background, the space which would allow us presentation at popular prices because of mass accommodations." And so, like other Jewish philanthropists of her time, Guggenheimer's interest was really in disseminating and legitimizing a particular elite sense of good taste to the masses, which then drove her to arrange these concerts. But I think, nevertheless, they're a really fascinating example of how one Jewish woman was able to have an enormous impact on many immigrants coming into New York at that time, in that time period. And then finally, we hit the opera singers, right? So the opera singers are part of this story, but they're not the whole story. And I think the narrative that we have come to know today is that the majority of Jewish women to participate in opera did so by singing on the opera stage. But we do know that by 1880, Jewish women could be found performing throughout the New York area in venues all across New York City, ranging from the Academy of Music to the Met and to the Lexington Opera House and to Town Hall. I think many of us know about Alma Gluck, Issa Kremer, and Beverly Sills, but other performers who were their contemporaries that most don't know about include Frida Langendorf, Rosette Ande, and Rita Fornia. But rather than discussing each of these singers, who could, I think, each be the subjects of books of their own, I really want to reframe them as cogs in this machine of the larger New York opera industry. Because while they're exceptional for their talent, they are just as essential as many of the other working professionals who haven't ever been included in this narrative at all. So let's turn now to the ballet dancers, because I think at least I hadn't thought about the ballet dancers as being a really vital part of this story before, but I'm learning that that's a mistake. So like opera singing, ballet was another really vital component of performance, which was tied to Europe and with associations of refinement. And these factors made it really an appealing career path to Jewish women from immigrant families who thought that going into ballet would be a great way to participate in the local labor force. And so many of the Jewish dancers from working class backgrounds in the US who then built their careers and began studying ballet as students in the Met Opera Ballet School, and then eventually joined the Met Opera Corps de Ballet in the 1910s and 20s, included Helen Tamaris, Rosa Feldman, Nora Kay, Ruthanna Boris, and Muriel Bentley. And there's also, of course, visiting ballerinas who came in from Europe to perform. And I think the most famous among them would be St. Petersburg-born prima ballerina of rumored Jewish descent, Anna Pavlova, whose tour brought her to the US in 1910. But again, I want to take us a little bit further afield of who we typically think of when we think about Jewish women in opera. So I'd like to introduce you to this woman, manager Annie Friedberg. And she was a German-born Jewish concert manager, and she actually had an office in the Metropolitan Opera House from 1911 to 1926. And she managed bookings for over 100 artists during her over 40-year career. And of course, she's been eclipsed by her more famous brother, pianist Carl Friedberg, in spite of the fact that she managed his career too. In 1914, Musical America observed that Friedberg was one of the few women managers of musical artists who has met with success in artist management. And likewise, her contemporary was a woman I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, Jessie Berndt. I'll go with her pre-three marriages name. She actually converted to Presbyterianism, but she was born in Amicus, Georgia, to German Jewish immigrants. And then she would spend her career helping singers to interpret their roles for the opera stage, and again, lived in a studio apartment above the Met. Berndt actually earned the designation the vocal coach and guardian angel of prima donnas. And she told a New York Times reporter that one of her only rules was that she would never take men as her students. During World War I, she converted her apartment in the Opera House into a war relief station, which is the photo you're looking at, thereby demonstrating how Jewish women could bring elite opera spaces deliberately into touch with politics and global circumstances. This is kind of a funny moment in time. Following the organization's formation by Jewish immigrant women in 1900, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, Local 38, became the Met seamstresses. And it's likely that a number of these women remained Jewish because when they went on strike in November 1925, their activities received English and Yiddish language coverage in the newspaper The Forward. But amusingly, the possible repercussions of the clothier strike carrying on any longer were then satirized in Der Grosser Kundis, which was a Yiddish language periodical. The caricature on the other side portrays a pantsless Metropolitan Opera conductor on the podium mid-performance of Carmen, and it's captioned, quote, "How the Metropolitan Opera's conductor would dress if the tailor strike continued." So, you know, their Jewish women can have a big impact in all facets of opera, from making the clothing to coaching the singers. And last but not least is Parisian-born pianist, opera conductor, and vocal coach of Dutch Jewish descent, Lena Cohen. And she actually made national headlines in February 1917 when she became the first woman to conduct an opera in the United States, or so it was claimed. The day after her debut performance with the Cosmopolitan Opera Company, the New York Times proclaimed, "Woman wields the baton. Lena Cohen conducts a performance of Carmen in Garden Theater," while the New York Review added, "Madame Cohen is first of sex to wield baton in grand opera in America." Unfortunately, far from remarking on her prowess as an opera conductor, the reporters commented only on her decision to wear a plain suit to the performance. Musical America, meanwhile, used condescending language to label Cohen, quote, "an ornament to the operatic conductor's chair, even if she may not yet occupy that of the president." They also equated her conducting debut to her turning the trick, which was clearly a euphemism for prostitution. Cohen, in turn, issued her own statement in response, reminding the public that she had not invaded the orchestra pit with the idea of making a sartorial display of herself. Rather, she wished to attract attention solely by the caliber of her reading of the score of Carmen, which I think is a perfectly fair thing to want as a woman in 1917, but what can you do? And so we return to the beginning. We are back in 1933. By the time soprano Queen Amarillo approached the Federation of Jewish Women's Organizations at their monthly meeting to ask for financial aid on behalf of the Met, there is no doubt that Jewish women had come to rely on opera as a tool of uplift and as a viable pathway into the national workforce. For the first time, Jewish women found themselves occupying a new, empowered position from which they could choose to bestow or deny aid of their own on the struggling opera house. In light of American Jewish women's decades-long engagement with opera culture, that the Met then sought out their financial support seems to me a somewhat fitting place to begin and conclude the narrative. And by 1940, December 1940, in fact, the Yiddish Forward featured a photograph of Met Opera star Lily Pons shaking hands with Mrs. Joseph Hammerstein, president of the New York chapter of Hadassah, in anticipation of an upcoming performance of Lakmeh on December 14th that would raise funds for the organization's work in Palestine. And so, armed with opera, Jewish women set out to fashion themselves and others as socially respectable and acculturated, in line with evolving expectations of American Jewish womanhood. Though Jewish women may not always have conducted opera-associated actions as Jews first, their diverse voluntary and labor efforts constitute a significant but overlooked part of the narrative of Jewish culture and American opera history. I think Jewish women's embracing of opera sheds light on the many vital roles that music has often played in helping minorities to integrate into the fabric of American society. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
People can see us a little bit, they can hear.
I'm gonna stop share.
Yeah.
And then hopefully.
Can you have your phone to, or I could use mine to make it so that I could put the MiFi on to get it better?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, let me get my phone.
How do I? Okay.
So for question and answer, I'm just gonna make sure that we can see. So what I'm gonna do is, yeah, so it's okay, they heard you, I made sure. So I'm going to put in my personal hotspot, and then you're gonna look for,
Am I changing internets or what am I
yeah,
doing?
you're going up here. Let's see, it should offer you a new one in a moment.
Strange, I'm not sure why.
Yeah, so go there again and let's look for other networks. No, I'll
stop
give you
video
mine.
and let me try restarting my video. Yeah, it
not, you can
technically
use
is on.
mine.
I'm just not sure.
You can
Yeah.
use
You know
mine.
what? Let's try yours. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll just switch computers. Hi, everyone.
One second.
Mute. Perfect.
Okay,
Yeah. Hi.
mute your.
Okay, great. I will mute over here and
No.
unmute over here. Great.
So Abraham has a question.
Yes,
Okay.
I
I have
do.
questions
First of
too.
all, Dr. Cooper, thank you so much for this very fascinating talk. I have a kind of a interesting question because you met Rabbi Diana at YIVO to learn Yiddish. My first language was Yiddish. I was born in 1937, and I didn't learn English until I started kindergarten. But in all of your talk, Yiddish doesn't exist except until like the middle of the presentation, where there's some mention of the forwards, which used to come only in Yiddish, and I get it now in English online.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing is that, or understand that, the heavy immigration periods of the 1890s up through like 1922 were largely Eastern European and all Yiddish speakers.
Mhm.
So then when we're going to the period where you're talking about in the beginning, they must be another group. We're talking
They
about
are.
Temple Emmanuel, which first of all is Reform.
Yes.
Second, they are probably the most wealthy in the nation, so that they're clearly talented and aspiring group. So does Yiddish fit in any of this story until, it's
Yeah.
missing?
Yeah, it's a good, oh, why am I, you know what, I'm gonna exit on this screen totally, and then there, okay, no echo back, great. I can just chat with you from Diana's computer, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, so the answer is yes, but again, I think you have to remember that you're absolutely right about there being multiple waves of immigration. We have Sephardic Jews arriving as early as 1654 from Recife, Brazil. And then we have a huge wave of German immigration in the 1800s. And then finally, by the end of the 19th century, we begin to have the Eastern European migration. And so, I think there's a lot of stereotype about the idea that the Eastern European immigrants were somehow less fit, less able to acculturate than their immigrants before them. But I think the real story is that the group before them had time to become settled, to set down roots in the city, to create institutions and sort of establish themselves, to build synagogues like Sharit Israel in the Sephardic Portuguese case, or Temple Emmanuel in the German Reform case. And so we have, with the opera performances and connectivity, we have a lot more connection with the earlier established communities, because they in turn have the social service organization set and the ability to then use those services to become involved in various ways in opera performance. With the Eastern European immigrants, we actually do start to see them hosting similar events to the ones that the previous generation had been hosting. It just takes them a little bit longer. So it's really early 1920s that we start to see Orthodox, conservative, and other Eastern European social service organizations like the Hebrew Sheltering Guardian Society, which was exclusively by and for Eastern European Jewish immigrants, then hosting the same kinds of events at places like the Metropolitan Opera House as these previous Reform and Sephardic congregations. I hope that kind of begins to answer your question. It's not that they're not part of the story, it's just that it takes them a little bit longer to get their feet under them, understandably. Yes, Susan.
So my grandparents were probably of this same time period, and they were all merchants and scrabbling in order to stay, financially stable. Do you happen to have any research on the price of tickets and what they would cost in today's terms?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, yes. So I do have research on the price of tickets. And what's interesting is they stayed relatively stable from the 1880s when the Opera House was established through 1940. And it really after you start to see major fluctuation in ticket prices. But I think the least expensive tickets were $1 or 50 cents for most of that time period. And then from there, of course, they went up to what we understand them to be now. Now, I think it would be $25 to get a standing room ticket at the Met. But Back in that day, it was 50 cents or about $1 all the way through that period until 1940. There was a little bit of fluctuation when various managers took over, but that's the approximate price. And then I think boxes or parterre seats were $7 or $8. So
How does that convert into modern day?
yeah, I'd have to
Currency.
plug it in to know for sure. I've done some of the conversion on the really big numbers the Jewish organizations were fundraising, but not necessarily the like $1 1880s to 2023. But it's probably a pretty easy plug-in into a Google system of some kind. Yeah, I would be curious about that. I should take a look. Thanks for that question. Oh, it's $130 today. Wow. Yeah, that would be extremely expensive for an immigrant just trying to get by. There's actually a really great story, not about a woman, but about a young man who was 12 years old that I found, and him taking himself for his birthday to the Met. He wrote about it in the 1960s, but he went in 1927. And he said he was holding more money than he'd ever held in his entire life to pay for his ticket. And he got to the theater and he tried to give them money for a standing room ticket and they said they were sold out. So he gave them even more money for a grand tier seat. And then just like fell in love with opera. And, in fact, he was there to see a Wagner opera. But yeah, we have sort of these deep, long Jewish ties and a willingness to really sacrifice and save to be able to go, even when this genre is just extraordinarily expensive for many of these individuals. Judy?
So my parents were German Jewish refugees, and in Europe, my mother went to the opera in fact, they were reformed, which was there considered not the word reformed, liberal. And they specifically had services on Friday nights. They went to service on Friday night so that Saturday they could go to the opera.
Yes.
And what always struck me, and that was children, very young children. She was maybe 5 when she started to go to the opera.
Yep.
But I guess my question, well, it's 2 questions. One, I think the cost was way cheaper in Europe, at least Germany and Vienna, to go to the opera. It was not super expensive, which I think is a huge difference. And then in this country, when they immigrated, my grandmother's greatest joy was that when the Met would actually then have the performances on WQXR, first on the radio and later on the television. So access became a different route, but it was still, I think, the expense compared to going to a movie. So in America, you could go to a film on Saturday and it would cost you 5 cents compared to the $5 you said. So first of all, there's a huge economic divide. So my question is, I guess, that I think Abraham and Susan are both pointing to access is incredibly difficult, but training is also. So my question is, I understand the scene in opera in Germany and Austria, but in Poland and many of these other countries, what was the experience of Jews and non-Jews in terms of their access to opera, the cost of it, and the cultural importance within the society as a part of an educational experience? And so when we look at Temple Emmanuel in New York, as Abraham so put out, you were talking about the ultra rich by the time they get there, but when they come here, they don't have this money and they're still going to the opera. So I'm wondering the cultural orientation and the difference in the different Eastern European countries as compared to, the German speaking 2 countries and the origins of opera, where the operas are written in German, Italian, and, their language orientation already is familiar, whereas your primary language, as Abraham said, is Yiddish. I don't remember seeing an opera written in Yiddish, whereas there was a Yiddish theater and there were Yiddish music. So why would a culture then go to what is alien to them as compared to, so to address that difference in Europe as well.
There's so many questions within your question. I love them all. I will try to pick up on as many of them as I can. So I guess I'll start at the end. There were actually efforts to translate grand opera into Yiddish for performance in New York. They admittedly were not extremely successful. I think you're right in that, again, this was an effort by sort of the most elite of the Yiddish speakers, in turn wanting to deliver opera to their communities, and their communities were not interested. They wanted to go to sort of what would be known today as Schund or trash theater, operettas and so on by Goldfaden, and operas by Jewish creators of that time was much more up their alley of interest to them. Nevertheless, they tried. It wasn't a hugely successful effort. And there was also another Jewish impresario who actually worked with Oscar Hammerstein. I was laughing as we drove up Oscar Hammerstein Way, but he worked with Oscar Hammerstein and then in turn tried to launch a Jewish American opera company with La Juive in Yiddish, using opera singers who sang at the Met. It was not successful. They had one performance and then the whole effort shuttered. So again, there were these sort of various efforts to bring opera in Yiddish translation to Yiddish speaking immigrants, but that really wasn't, the most appealing. What's interesting and around the cost differentials with Europe versus New York is that in Europe, opera is government funded largely, which is an enormous difference between the US context where, all of the money is coming from the masses essentially to keep the genre running and accessible, pertaining to, going to services on Friday so that you could then go to the opera on Saturday. I've heard stories about people arranging their children's bar mitzvahs on certain Saturdays so they wouldn't miss certain Met broadcasts, which is really hilarious. And actually, I can tell you a great story behind the Met broadcasts, which were really only thanks to a Jewish immigrant man, or a couple of Jewish immigrant men, actually. So one of the men who worked for the radio company was David Sarnoff, and he was the head of the RCA. And it's thanks to him that the Met Opera broadcasts began in 1930. But then jumping forward into 1940, there was a big sort of uproar because the head of the Texaco oil company had made some kind of anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi comment. And Benjamin Sonnenberg, another Jewish man, came to him and said, I'm a PR guy. I think what you should do is you should sponsor the Met Opera broadcasts. And the Texaco company said, okay. And they took that on, and the sponsorship lasted from 1940 to 2004. And in the official history of the Met Opera broadcasts, Benjamin Sonnenberg's name doesn't even appear. The whole anecdote of his involvement with making the suggestion is only in his memoir. So, these are the kinds of stories that I'm trying to restore to the narrative in my book project, the larger story of this phenomenon of the Jewish encounter with opera. But, it's very much embedded. It's happening at all different levels of sort of Jewish groups and community organizations and backgrounds, Jewish backgrounds. But I do think that the government funding in Europe has a lot to do with the widespread nature of the access there in comparison to the United States context, and why it is perceived as such like a high class genre in the US.
Was opera common in Poland? In other words, in Warsaw, did we have, and who would be attending those kind of?
It was common in Poland too, and in Warsaw especially. And I think at the beginning of a colleague's book, actually on the Yiddish theater world, she starts with an anecdote about a Jewish man who would sneak out, have his refined clothes in the bushes, put them all on, go to the opera, and then on his way home, he would quickly change out of his fancy clothes and put his shtetl clothes back on and then go home. So there might have been more of a disconnect with the Warsaw Jewish connection with the opera industry, or at least that story would suggest there was more of a disconnect. But again, there's also I don't know, have any of you heard of the story of the Der Wilner Ballabessel? Yeah, it was this short story, which then turned into the film Overture to Glory, which came out in 1940, featuring Moshe Oisher. But the story that tells is very much like The Jazz Singer, but about opera. It's about a cantor who is lured to the Warsaw Opera, actually, and performs in Halko there, and then has his sort of moment of crisis and returns to his community in distress. But again, we have these very parallel narratives of Jewish encounter with opera in places like Warsaw in the narratives.
Were Jews in any way discriminated against in purchasing their tickets because in Germany, at least my mother was in Stuttgart,
Yeah.
this was not a problem till Hitler came to power. Then, of course, this changed.
Yeah.
But in Poland, where Jews, and also your religious orientation in Poland was more Orthodox. You didn't have liberal, so their performances would be on a Saturday,
Right.
during the day, which also I'm obviously Sunday was the Christian holy day, so that was a selection. And do you think that that possibly contributed to the Jewish orientation toward opera in both Vienna, where you had a more liberal practice of religion, and in Germany, where you had alternative to services and practices, and how did that impact in Poland? Was there anti-Semitic treatment at opera houses for purchasing tickets?
Yeah, I can't tell you about the treatment in Poland or Germany because I'm really an Americanist with the work that I do, but I can tell you that the story that sort of features as the core of my whole book project is that when you retell how Jewish people came to opera and the opera industry in America, and you reorient it through a Jewish lens, and you kind of create a counter history of the conventional story of, let's say, the Metropolitan Opera's founding, you do see an inherent discrimination against Jewish ticket purchases, and specifically opera box purchases at the Met. And in fact, the whole institution can be reframed as having opened because a newly rich group of Christians went to the Academy of Music, where August Belmont was working, who was a Jewish convert to Christianity, and they wanted opera boxes from him at the Academy of Music at 14th Street and Irving Place. And he didn't have any more opera boxes. So he said, "I'm very sorry, I don't have any." And they went off in a huff and they founded the Metropolitan Opera Real Estate Company Limited in 1880. And in their bylaws, it says that they exclude undesirable persons, meaning Jewish people, from being able to purchase stock or opera boxes at the Met. And so this is the story of the founding of the institution. At its heart is this reactionary narrative of a Jewish man having to refuse them, and then them going off and founding the Metropolitan. And it's kind of been buried in the bylaws, and it's really, only if you're looking for that kind of language, the exclusionary type of language, do you notice that this story is really at the heart of the founding of the institution.
Is it still there, that
it's in the meeting minutes from March 1900 in the archives, but it's not in their continued printing of their board or bylaws.
So when was it changed to eliminate that bylaw?
I don't know exactly when it was changed, but you stop seeing it after sort of those initial printings. But in the Jewish newspapers, you're then seeing reactions to that and knowledge that this is the case at the Met. So there's even people saying, even as before the bylaws are even printed, there's people saying, "Oh, they're going to come and try to make you buy their stock and their opera boxes, but you should really stay away from the Metropolitan Opera." But of course, nobody listens because it's the Met and it's this new grand institution in the city, and Jewish people want to be part of the new exciting thing. So, yeah.
I have two questions. One is if you could say a little bit more about your own attraction to opera and how it is that you came to focus so intently. And also, I am curious about the history you uncovered around the kind of transition from Jews being racialized as other than white to white, and how that, you touched upon it, but it sounds like you went there with your research.
Yeah.
So those two questions. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I can say that I came to this whole subject matter and this project and sort of the whole Met Opera narrative. I came to it all because I started classical voice training at age 4. And I sang through the entire Royal Conservatory system in Canada, which is sort of the basis for my musical training, and sang examinations every year, and started an undergrad in voice and finished the undergrad in voice, but very quickly realized I didn't want a career performing all over the world. I would much rather, study, learn about this phenomenon as a cultural phenomenon with broader impact than do it myself. So I occasionally do cantorial soloist work still, but I don't actively seek out performance opportunities the way that I used to. So that's kind of how I came to this work. And the second question was about the racialization narratives. Yeah, it's a good question. I had a suspicion that the story would take some kind of questions of race turn. And I think the cosmetics findings really solidified that for me, because, you know, when you're seeing Plexo evening white makeup in the press, and then it's directly tied to opera going, and they're saying you need this to make you the perfect, you know, presence at the local opera. It's sort of indisputable that there are these multiple layers happening, and this interplay between race and opera going. But I really do think that turn away from that, you stop seeing the advertisements bearing that kind of language by the 20s, which seems relatively early, but by the 20s. And I think the sort of American Jewish historians widely agree that the full sort of move away from viewing Jews as a race or a racial group happens post-war. And that's sort of when that has been excised, and there's the move to suburbia and all of these big major shifts in Jewish life events. But yeah, my focus is really the pre-war era. Yeah, so it's still kind of at play, but maybe more covert than Plexo Evening White. Yeah. Yeah. But I think one of my favorite stories is that Yetta K. Stoddard story, Yellow Elbows, about making that direct connection. It's a really long, short story, actually. I think it's like 4 pages in the press, but making that direct connection between a young woman learning how to perform opera, and then being raised from this lower class to the upper class. Yeah. Yeah, but there's just so much happening in these stories, and it's just very prevalent, I think. And there are also admittedly stories that I came across of Jewish women who were not wealthy, who were the ones making the opera gowns in the tenements. And there's a memoir by a woman named Rose Cohen, and she talks about how she didn't understand why other Jewish women needed all of these different types of gowns, the opera gowns and the day gowns and the night gowns. Like, she just couldn't wrap her head around how anybody could need that much stuff. And yet she was the one who was sewing them in the tenements in the garment district. So again, we have Jewish women touched and being touched by this genre in all kinds of ways, not necessarily in equivalent ways per se, but they're all coming to this story, and they are part of this story, I think, is kind of how I like to think about it. Yeah, are there any other questions, or should we? Oh, in the audience here.
I remember growing up with back in the 70s, and growing up, you had to study the libretto.
Yes.
To understand what was going on.
Yep.
What did people do to go to the opera? Because obviously in a bunch of different languages that they may or may not know. Did they understand the stories? How did that?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question for those on Zoom. The question was about how people would study the librettos in the way that they would, say, in the 70s or 80s or 90s when they would go to the opera. And I'm not sure that the approach was necessarily the same. I think it was more of the let the music wash over you. At least that's how Sonnenberg describes it when he went as a child, that he just sort of sat back and let the sound reverberate over him, and that his seat was had terrible sight lines. He couldn't see anything, of course, because he was a child. And the Met was not designed for anybody but the people in the opera boxes to be able to see, which is why they eventually built the new Met. But with respect to the librettos, I don't know that it was as widespread a practice to be able to obtain one, but I do know, and I did find this great clipping about a library in the Lower East Side that would have all of these opera librettos constantly out among the Jewish immigrants. Like, they would constantly be checked out of the library. So maybe that's the answer to your question, is that they would go to the library and they would take out a copy and they'd take it home and read it over, and then they'd go. But that was a really fun finding. I'm going to include that in my education pedagogy chapter for the book. Yeah. Should we wrap up if there's no other questions?
Any other questions? Well, is there a question? Anyone else have a question? Yeah, if you're gonna mute yourself, Judy.
How do you see opera? I don't know if your book is following it to the present day in terms of Jewish desired accessibility, and as far as what percentage of opera goers, because I know the Met has obviously been hurting for a long time, but their prices sure haven't come down. And I know they now occasionally have TDF tickets through the teachers, but Could you give us an idea of the Jewish involvement, let's say in the last, 10 years in the direction of young people? And because whenever I go, it's completely gray. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't speak with that much specificity to the contemporary Jewish perspective on opera. I do know that there are Jewish people that work in the board of director levels nowadays for the board and who play in the orchestra and who sing on the stage. So there's definitely a Jewish presence. My project really only goes up until 1940, and then I sort of hard stop there because I figured otherwise I'll be heading right into I don't know, this book I'll already be having challenges to stop at 100,000 words with this book. So I'll leave it for a future project and more research and all of that. But I really do think this sort of golden age of Jewish presence on the opera stage happens in the 40s and 50s with Beverly Sills, Richard Tucker, that whole generation of singers, Jen Pierce, and so on and so on. Yeah, there's great clippings as well about multiple Jewish opera singers of that time period being on stage singing multiple roles in the same shows together. And we don't get that so much beforehand, except we do get a Jewish Hansel and Gretel, two women, Bella Alton and Lena Abarbanel, playing opposite each other in 1904. So, there are these moments where Jewish people are really a visible presence in opera performance, but into the present day, everything you've said is correct. Like I too have seen the opera tickets for sale on the TDF fund. I know there's a big effort to get students out to the opera, and they offer tickets for $25 or $30 for young people nowadays, which was great for me as a PhD student, honestly. I got to take full advantage, but yeah, I don't know that you can even tell so much anymore who the Jewish people are necessarily at the opera house or who's making an effort to be there. I don't know, maybe there's some kind of way to survey it sociologically, and I can look into that one day. But for now, I'm just tracking down people's grandparents and speaking to as many people as I can about their own family histories pertaining to relationality to opera in the pre-war period. But hopefully one day that'll become something I can look into further. Yeah, thank you all so much for your time today and for coming. This was so much fun.
Thank you so much. It was so great to have you. Wow, it was wonderful. And I'm so happy to see you all who are here today. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, for coming in person here. And we'll see you all very soon.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thanks. So let's see. Record. I think it just stopped. Let's see.
Yeah, here, that's the pause.
So then just like
that's that
that.
one.
Okay. Stop recording.